For 42 years, one man ruled a state without a constitution, without political parties, without a successor, relying solely on his own personality as the foundation of the system. When that system finally fell, it fell all at once within a matter of months, with no institutions left to absorb the shock. Muammar Gaddafi did not simply lose power. He lost a state he had built to exist only through him. This is the story of what happens when a leader believes his own myth so completely that he stops distinguishing his own fate from the fate of the people he rules. That belief in his own myth did not appear overnight. It was built over decades through thousands of small decisions that systematically removed every voice capable of offering a different picture of reality, until the only version of Libya left standing was the one Gaddafi had invented inside his own head. Few 20th century leaders fused revolutionary ideology with personal cult as consistently as Gaddafi, making it nearly impossible to separate where his political vision ended and where the sheer need for personal validation began. Gaddafi seized power in 1969 as a 27-year-old officer, a young man full of revolutionary fervor and a sincere belief that he could build a more just order. But instead of building institutions that would outlive him, he built a system in which the institution was him personally. His so-called Green Book was not merely a political manifesto, it was an attempt to reduce the entire philosophy of the state to his personal vision, to the point that parliament and traditional government were formally abolished in the name of direct democracy, which in practice meant an absolute unpredictability was not accident but strategy. Gaddafi deliberately cultivated the image of an eccentric, unpredictable leader, from bizarre speeches at the United Nations to traveling with a Bedouin tent and a personal guard of exclusively female bodyguards. That unpredictability served a double purpose. It confused outside adversaries who could not anticipate his moves, while at home it created a climate of fear in which no one could be certain where the limits of tolerance lay. When no one knows the rules, everyone is forced into caution, and caution easily turns into submission. Institutionally, Gaddafi systematically dismantled every potential center of power that could threaten his position. He deliberately kept the army weak and fragmented, relying instead on mercenary units and personal militias loyal exclusively to him and his family. This was a rational choice for preserving short-term power, but in the long run it meant the state had no institution capable of functioning without him. The pattern repeated itself in the economic sphere. Although Libya, thanks to its oil reserves, had the potential to build a strong middle class and an independent private sector, Gaddafi deliberately maintained the population's economic dependence on the state, and thereby on him personally. Subsidies, public sector jobs, and direct payouts from oil revenue functioned as a mechanism for buying loyalty, while simultaneously preventing the emergence of any economically independent class capable of articulating an alternative political voice. In this way, the entire society, not just the military and political apparatus, was made structurally dependent on his survival and power. As the years passed, Gaddafi's circle of advisors increasingly consisted of family members and personally loyal individuals, people whose own survival depended on telling him what he wanted to hear. Criticism, even the mildest, was treated as betrayal of the revolution he personified. Journalists, academics, and dissidents who asked uncomfortable questions disappeared, were imprisoned, or forced into exile. What is most striking is how Gaddafi reacted to the Arab Spring in 2011, not by acknowledging legitimate grievances, but by insisting the protests were the work of foreign conspiracies and rats who needed to be exterminated house by house. That rhetoric was not merely a propaganda tool, it reflected a genuine belief that he and his vision were identical to the state, and that any resistance to him was, by definition, resistance to Libya itself. That confusion between personality and state made him unable to see the true scale of the threat until it was too late for any peaceful way out of the crisis. Diplomats and foreign observers who met him in his final years in power described a man increasingly detached from realities on the ground. Surrounded by advisors who dared not report the decline in his popularity or the growing unrest in eastern cities like Benghazi. When rebels first seized territory, Gaddafi's own television appearances in which he claimed the people loved him more than ever appeared grotesquely out of step with what the world could see on the ground through independent sources. That mismatch between his perception and reality was not an act for the public, it was a sincere reflection of the information bubble in which he had spent his final decade in power. This pattern, a leader who equates himself with the state to the point that institutions cease to exist independently of him, has a clear historical parallel in the Roman Emperor Nero, whose megalomania and conviction of his own irreplaceability eventually led even his own guard to abandon him. A similar dynamic is visible in Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania, whose personality cult ran so deep that he genuinely believed the people who took to the streets against him had to be manipulated by foreign powers rather than expressing real discontent. In all these cases, the common thread is the absence of institutional memory outside the leader himself. When a system is built to function exclusively through one personality, that personality's fall leaves no room for gradual transition. It leaves a vacuum that is most often filled by chaos, violence, and years of instability. Precisely what happened in Libya after 2011. It is worth comparing this pattern to cases where transition was more peaceful precisely because institutions existed independently of a single personality, such as Spain after the death of Francisco Franco, where, despite decades of authoritarian rule, enough functional structures survived to allow a relatively orderly transition to democracy. The difference between the Libyan collapse and the Spanish transition is not a difference in the cruelty of the two leaders, but a difference in whether anything besides emptiness remained behind them. Gaddafi's fate, caught in a drainage pipe near his hometown, killed by rebels he had once promised to exterminate, feels almost symbolically cruel for a man who spent 4 decades insisting he was irreplaceable. His mistake was not simply that he was authoritarian. His deeper mistake was the belief that personal vision, however powerful, could substitute for lasting institutions. Power that cannot be transferred, power that exists only in one body and one mind, is ultimately more fragile than any system that shares responsibility. Gaddafi's story reminds us that the myth of the irreplaceable leader, however convincing it sounds while it lasts, always carries within it the seed of its own destruction, because the moment the man disappears, so does everything he built exclusively around himself. The irony is that in the years before his fall, Gaddafi often spoke publicly about fearing the fate of other Arab leaders overthrown by popular uprisings, reassuring himself and others that his bond with the Libyan people was different, deeper, almost familial. That same rhetoric, the belief that he was the exception to the rules that governed every other authoritarian ruler, proved to be his final and most dangerous illusion, because it stripped him of the ability to recognize in time that the same historical force that had toppled his neighbors was closing in on his own door.